No doubt you are thinking to yourself that this ought to be good. Why does Martin Kramer, of all people, think it worth bringing government and academe together? After all, didn't he write that book exposing the biases of academic Middle Eastern studies? Well, I did write that book, but by training and temperament, I still regard myself as an academic. I spent 25 years as a tenured faculty member in a university, and I still crave the tranquility of academe, even if it's only for a couple of months a year at Harvard. I've done that the last 4 academic years. Because you see, in the real world, it's dog eat dog, whereas in the academy, it's just the reverse. And because I do continue to tour academe annually, I probably know more than most of you about its assets, those assets locked up inside. And they fall into 2 broad categories. First, academe is a vast open source, a store of knowledge about the wider world, probably the largest outside of government itself. The academy is home to people who know foreign languages, histories, traditions, politics. It's also full of well-educated people who come from those foreign places that preoccupy policymakers. If that knowledge can be mined and refined here, it might save the need to collect it there. Now, to those of you who shake your heads and say that bias taints this knowledge, I remind you that American parents, even those disdainful of America's tenured faculty, draw deeply on their personal wealth, sometimes to the tune of 50 grand a year, to assure their children the credentials these same tenured faculty confer. Now, if you believe that your own 18-year-old is capable of sorting useful knowledge from the biases of faculty, there's no reason to think the United States government incapable of doing the same. And that brings me to the second asset. The Academy is also home for 4 years or more to most of America's most promising young people. Government, of course, recruits students on its own, and there are training and scholarship programs to create incentives for students. But the persuasive input of a faculty mentor is a powerful reinforcement for any student. If relationships could be established with the professorial mentors of outstanding students, then it could facilitate their recruitment and save a lot of hit and miss in sorting out recruits later. Now, there was a time long ago when academics were quite happy to do research for government and help recruit students. That was before Vietnam, the legacy of which is still very much felt in the academy. The campus radicals of the 1960s became the academic mandarins of the 1990s, and I think their rule of the roost is still symbolically expressed by the continued banning of ROTC from a number of important campuses in this country. But the climate has changed somewhat, in part because of 9/11, as Rob indicated, but I think also due to the election of Barack Obama. Presidential power is now in the hands of one of their own, graduate of Columbia and Harvard, former faculty member at the University of Chicago. Academic believers in smart power are now keen to prove its applicability in the real world, to prove the thesis. Now, no one knows how long this will last, and I suspect not very long. But this is still a once-in-a-generation opening, and it has potential for shifting the relationship between government and academe. But for government to promote that, it needs an in-depth understanding of what drives and motivates academics. Now, the American Research University is a vastly different setting from, say, a think tank or a government agency. Yet while the codes of academic life may sometimes seem as impenetrable as, say, tribal affiliations in the Swat Valley, they also have, like those affiliations, an internal logic of their own. It shouldn't be beyond government's ability to decode that logic and get at those assets, especially since many in government are, of course, graduates of the very same institutions. I'm going to touch here on what I regard as the 3 keys to understanding the inner workings of academe. The first is peer review, the crucial need of academics to have their work validated by their peers. How can government, which of course has no peer standing, build peer-like clout? The second is independence, the belief of academics that they're the most truthful of all people, thanks to the freedom conferred by endowments and tenure. How can government, which endows no professorships and no programs, gain the leverage of those who do? And the third is access, the preoccupation of academics with securing and maintaining their access to sources and data and foreign places. How can government, which classifies information, share enough of it to compete? Let me start with peer review, which is in many ways at the very core of academic life. Academic disciplines are intensely jealous of their autonomy, and academics know that their career fates will be decided secretly by peers around the world. And the result is that academics are extremely sensitive to the zeitgeist in their disciplines, and this sensitivity, I would submit, is particularly acute in the humanities and the social sciences, which tend to be driven by politics and fad and fashion to a far greater extent than other disciplines on the campus. Such peer communities constitute perhaps the most entrenched obstacle to government's engagement with academe. At the very least, they insist upon their prerogative to scrutinize every program or relationship or connection to determine whether it conceals something that could endanger academic freedom. And since they concluded decades ago that the principal threat to such freedom emanates from Washington, it's not surprising that the records of academic associations are full of resolutions warning members against the temptations dangled before them by the state. So how does government evade or erode such opposition? Well, one route has been to establish relations with individual scholars away from the campus and on a strictly confidential basis. Emil Nachle, some of you know him, when he was at the CIA, ran what he has called in a recent book a comprehensive academic outreach program for the agency, claiming, and I quote him, over the years, hundreds of U.S. academics with expertise in the Middle East, Muslim countries, and Islamic activism worldwide have participated. Now, of course, not one of these hundreds will admit to having participated, and Emil won't name any. If it's true, though, it really is quite interesting, and many in academia would say quite scandalous. But a one-day symposium in a nondescript building somewhere in Northern Virginia is a very low-grade form of engagement. The larger objective is to influence the research agendas within academia. And now this is regarded by some academics as a far more intrusive project. Academics take pride in producing work for one another according to rules internal to their field and according to priorities that they share and often no one else shares. And as a result, research clusters around a few privileged subjects deemed especially important, in part because they are irrelevant to the mundane interests of the United States. That's how, for example, Iraq got excluded from the research agenda, the academic research agenda, in the 1990s. Dick Norton of Boston University said this on the eve of the invasion of Iraq, and I quote him, "We don't have a single academic expert in America who understands how Iraqi politics works. In 2003, not a clue." And Judith Yaffe of the National Defense University echoed the same lament. "There's nobody in this country," she said, "who really knows the internal dynamics, the fabric of how Iraq works." And that, despite the fact that there'd already been one war with Iraq and another could be easily predicted at the time. So how can government drive the research agenda in preferred directions? Well, one approach is to identify a mediating think tank that falls outside the formal purview of the academy and to channel an initiative through it. The main drawback of this approach is that it lacks academic respectability. I'm not talking here about scholarship, but academic respectability. It can be scholarly and yet not still have the accoutrements of academic credibility. So it constitutes no more than moonlighting for the academic partner. A slightly more academic model rests on stimulating research within the space provided by such quasi-governmental institutions as the United States Institute of Peace, or the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I was a scholar twice at the latter. These institutions have built solid reputations as semi-scholarly settings in which academics can rub shoulders with officials. Because they depend in part on federal funding, they tune their research agendas to current policy needs. But because of their independence from any single government agency, they're difficult to pigeonhole and thus easier for academics to engage. And work done there does confer a kind of academic credit. Now, of course, the Wilson Center and USIP are tilted toward research that favors, let's say, engagement or diplomacy over kinetic action. This leaves out the Defense Department. Now, of course, Defense has the traditional machinery of contractual relations with think tanks, and to a limited extent, the military can also use its own academic institutions as links to wider academe. But the Defense Department also would like its own academic extension, which is the background to the Minerva Initiative, which was launched by Secretary of Defense Gates in 2008. The department offers research grants to academics in areas that it prioritizes, and to disarm critics and to confer academic credibility, some of the selection of grantees has been outsourced to the National Science Foundation. Secretary Gates, I remind you, was a university president, Texas A&M, I think. And last year, in announcing Minerva, he made a special appeal to university presidents for greater cooperation in the social sciences. This has not precluded controversy. There's quite a bit of it surrounding Minerva, but it is up and running, and they have announced 2 cycles of grants to date. The bottom line, surveying all this, is that while each agency has its own approach, the shared objective should be the same. It's the creation of large peer communities within universities that relish their government ties. The aim is to transform the perception of government partnership from something that's unusual and slightly suspect to something commonplace and mundane, in other words, comparable to the research grant programs of the major foundations. And government would do well to take a page from foundations because they envelope their proceedings in the formal trappings of academic style, peer review, which enhances the prestige of their grants and the willingness of promotion and tenure committees to treat the resulting projects without prejudice. The thing to remember is that individualistic, as academics pretend to be, when it comes to dealing with government, there's more comfort in the herd. And the larger the herd, the more comfortable the individual. So strategy 1 is to create and encourage peer communities within academia itself. Let me move briskly to independence and money. It's part of the myth of the academy that it alone is truly capable of self-regulation, because only it benefits from practices which guarantee that its denizens will always speak truth. The most important of these is the endowment. Universities and colleges are, of course, funded from many sources, but the most prestigious of the sources are endowments in perpetuity. And endowments are generally described as hard money, as opposed to research grants, which are placed under the rubric of soft money. Now, academics may be believers in soft power, but they have a strong preference for hard money. Those in the university whose livelihoods depend on soft money find themselves in an endless cycle of grant submissions and reviews, whereas those who benefit from endowments have the leisure to pursue their inquiries wherever they lead them. Endowments are also connected to tenure. Tenure may or may not be backed by an actual or specific endowment, but they're commitments that trump all others. Nothing is more sacrosanct in the university than a tenured position, and no tenured position is more sacrosanct than one backed up by a specific endowment. Taken together, endowments and tenure are what exempt academics from continuous accountability. An academic, once tenured and endowed, has more protections than any person in America, more than CEOs, generals, journalists, congressmen, and even the president, all of whom may be dismissed or impeached or voted out of office for some perceived failure. The U.S. government operates in this environment at a distinct disadvantage. It can't endow programs and shares, whereas lots of other players on the academic scene can. And this obviously includes individuals and corporations, but it even includes foreign individuals and foreign governments. In Middle Eastern studies in particular, endowment money from within the region has had distorting effects on the academic research agenda. So how can the government approximate the impact of an endowment without actually making one? Well, the Centers of Excellence sponsored by the Department of Homeland Security constitute one possible model. Shortly after the department's establishment, it launched a competition for multi-year, multi-million-dollar project grants large enough to permit the formation of full-fledged centers. Now, no government agency can assure funding beyond a 3 or 4 year cycle. But the expectation is that these centers will, if they perform, enjoy continued funding into the future. Mark is involved in a similar network, which is funded by the intelligence community, although it's more oriented towards generating student recruits than research. The centers of excellence highlight the one advantage government has over every other player in academe. Government can bring to bear very large sums of money by academic standards and spread those resources over many institutions in such a way as to create almost an instant network. Size counts, and while government can't make large endowments, it can make multi-year commitments on an unparalleled scale. So strategy 2 is to spend like a prince, maybe like a Saudi prince. Let me touch briefly on my third theme, access. What does government have that academe doesn't? Well, the answer is a flood of information, many cuts above what one finds in the library or on the internet, and a range of overseas outposts which facilitate all sorts of interesting interactions beyond the usual reach of academics. What can't government provide? Well, access to places where suspicion of the U.S. government runs high, for example, Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon or the Islamic Republic of Iran. Getting to such places is difficult, and it's often conditioned on the researcher becoming an amplifier of, say, Palestinian or Iranian grievances against the United States. Now, personally, I find this sort of self-interested ingratiation distasteful, but if this is the choice of an academic, then it's hard to object. But another strategy I think is more sinister and crosses the line into a kind of intellectual McCarthyism. This is the claim, which is sometimes very aggressively made inside professional associations, that those academics who do engage the U.S. government for whatever reason endanger their colleagues and so should be isolated or censured. The present controversy surrounding the human terrain teams, which are anthropologists, also there's some other social scientists involved, who are embedded with U.S. military forces in Iraq and Afghanistan, that is, I think, a case in point. Many in the Anthropological Guild have condemned both the program and its participants because the embedding of anthropologists allegedly compromises the field access of all anthropologists by rendering all anthropologists suspect. And it's just one step from this to the claim that any scholar who secures access through a government connection is a hazard to all of his or her colleagues. So is there any sort of access that the U.S. government can provide which doesn't involve such controversial methods as embedding? Well, there's still a vast quantity of open source materials collected by government and never distributed to the public. Then, too, there are the government's own reports distilling the open sources. That's thousands upon thousands of papers which may as well be unclassified, resting as they do on unclassified sources. Then there are certain captured documents, such as those from terrorist groups, that can be, and in fact are being made, available to researchers. And out in the field, government can provide access to difficult-to-reach places and hard-to-find people. The challenge of government is to fashion initiatives that provide academic partners with first access to these databases and resources, and this doesn't require declassification of secret sources or security clearances for academic scholars, measures that might compromise either government or academe or both. But this third strategy of opening the lid of the treasure chest can have a real impact in a competitive academic setting where special material is a research advantage. At the same time, I do think it's important to spur a discussion within the academy about the ways in which control of access by foreign governments distorts research agendas and research findings. For years, academic radicals have kept the spotlight on the way that cooperation with the U.S. government allegedly corrupts the academy. But a case can be made that securing access from authoritarian governments and police states has much greater potential to corrupt. All access comes at a cost. In comparison, the cost exacted by the U.S. government is so low as to be negligible, and the more this truth is propagated throughout academe, the easier it will be for academics to engage government openly and without apology. Now, dear friends, even if all the barriers between government and the academy could be dismantled through magic intercession, the years during which academe retreated into itself changed its culture. Academe became inwardly oriented and highly specialized. One political scientist has called this the cult of irrelevance, and it's left even the academics skeptical about whether they can make a contribution. These doubts were put on display for Washington when Harvard political scientist Joseph Nye penned an op-ed entitled "Scholars on the Sidelines" for the Washington Post earlier this year. And Nye wrote that, quote, "Scholars are paying less attention to questions about how their work relates to the policy world, and in many departments, a focus on policy can hurt one's career. If anything," he wrote, "the trends in academic life seem to be headed in the opposite direction," end of quote. It would be very easy to share Joe's pessimism, but I don't. I see a different attitude in two places. Among younger scholars drawn to these subjects by 9/11, and on universities and colleges far from Harvard and its top-tier peers. In these quarters, I increasingly hear echoes of the famous statement by Louis Pasteur, "Science has no fatherland, but the scientist must have one." It's probably true that the disciplines push young scholars in other directions, but these are not normal times. Resources are scarce. Universities are eager for their share of, let's call it, stimulus. The younger and hungrier faculty are, the more likely they are to take a chance if the potential rewards outweigh the risks. And add the Obama effect in academia, and the opportunities for all forms of engagement, outreach, and outsourcing seem more promising than they've been in a very long time. Now, to get there, government must package its initiatives in ways that defer to the academic consensus on professionalism and ethics. It must make grants in ways that create strong peer communities supportive of engagement with government. It must focus on creating centers of excellence and provide them with resources tantamount to endowments to give direction to research agendas. And it must find creative ways to give academics access to the wealth of information which is the byproduct of U.S. primacy in the world. I conclude, it would be easy for me to stand here in a think tank and tell you that the think tanks are the end-all and the be-all. The think tanks, as Rob indicated, arose in part precisely because the Academy withdrew from the arena, and for that opening we should be grateful. But American power and influence are enhanced when all the pistons are firing, and that's in everyone's interest. I am no fan of this administration, and I'm a perennial critic of academe. But if government and the ivory tower now begin to re-engage, I'll be pleased if I've done something small to promote it.